Welcome to the Supported Living Property Podcast with your host, me, Lisa Brown, the place to learn about supported living property investing. Hi Saif, it's great to have you here. Thanks for coming. How are you today?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me, Lisa. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, it should be a good chat, I think. Do you want to, for people who don't know you, do you want to tell people a little bit about you?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Saif Derzi. So I run a property investment company called SDGB Properties, and within that we've got a few bolt-on businesses. So we've got a business called Property Buys Today, where it's a cash buying business. We generate a lot of our own leads into that. We've also got a development company called KDSD as well, and then we've got a property management company called Letco, and every single business is interconnected in a way, and they all sort of push in the same direction. So even though it sounds like four different businesses, it's very, very similar. And we've got the same back office team as well, working all within that.
Okay, that makes sense. What did you do before property? How have you been doing property for a while, or?
Yeah, so I started investing in property in 2015. Prior to that, I studied pharmacy at university. So I did a 4 years master's degree, then did sort of 1 year as a pre-reg, and then I really got into pharmacy for about 2 years, in which case I did enjoy it, but it was just a bit too repetitive. So it was the repetitive nature that just didn't really do it for me. And I started looking at business as a whole. I actually got into a sort of pharmaceutical development business prior to property, made a bit of money from that, and then thought, right, how can I sustain this money rather than spending it? And naturally, I just got sort of drawn into property and then went from there, really. So I took a lot of my business practices from that business into property. So I looked at property as a business straight away rather than looking at it as a side hustle, or people view it, I guess, as a side income or a pension scheme sometimes, don't they?
Which I guess explains your really lovely organised structure that you have and that approach that you've taken from the beginning.
Absolutely.
And then obviously, we're here talking about supported living, and I know that you invest in supported living properties. How did that come about, Saif? How did you get to start doing that?
Yeah, I think I'm an accidental supported living landlord, as most people are. I think you never. It's very difficult to be deliberate with this stuff, and we come back to. I think we were in a clubhouse room once, and we talked about the chicken or the egg. Do you bring the property to the provider, or the provider and work it backwards and find a property for them? And I think at the start, 99% of the people that I speak to, and certainly from our point of view, we had a property. We refurbed it. We then brought it to the market and thought, we were approached by a supported living provider at the time that had basically had I think it was a unit 3 doors up from ours, and they basically said, look, we've got our staff there already. They're sort of providing a couple of hours support a week. Could we look at taking yours on? We just realised it's been nicely refurbed, etc. And that's how we got the conversation started. So yeah, it's been a really interesting journey from there, really. But just generally speaking, we got started with it was a block of 3 flats, really run down. We bought it from auction. Everything that you could have wanted in an auction property, it was burnt down. It was I think it was an ex brothel, all sorts of issues with it. But we refurbed it to a good standard. It was 3 flats, all self-contained, so it really suited this provider, right close to the city centre, so it had all the amenities. So just ticked a lot of boxes for them, and naturally, from our point of view, it ticked the box. It ticked the boxes as well from a yield / sustainability perspective as well, of the guaranteed rents and obviously longer term renting it out to them.
And then how did it flow from there? Did you then build that relationship with that provider and develop more properties for them, or?
Yeah, exactly. So from there, they had a bit of a mandate, really. So they said, well, we're looking for 2 properties in this area, 1 property in this area. To be fair, they were looking for properties in areas where they were probably, I'd say, higher value, less yield driven. And we looked at it from a point of view of, okay, well, we can look at establishing a relationship with them. They really needed at the time. I think the contract was for abused women. So clearly they had an immediate need for this. And we sort of said to them, look, we'll turn one of these around, because there wasn't really many landlords interested in that yield. And then we really developed the relationship from there. So they knew that we were trying to support them, not just trying to do this as a business, but also support them as well, to support their business. So it sort of went hand in hand. And from there, we developed a relationship, and it went from there, really. And then we developed a relationship in one area and then went to other areas and started supporting them with it. And then we started working with other providers as well.
That's interesting. And so basically to foster that relationship, you had to not go for the world's best property deal, is what you're saying, really, isn't it? You ended up with a deal that other people may have turned down to develop that relationship.
It's good business and relationship management in general. And it's not just looking at stuff from your point of view, but looking at a holistic point of view of, you can blend that in with the high yielding stuff, and also if they're giving you stuff that you're getting first refusal on, for example. So as an example, that they went through a procedure of going through all of their low EPC rating properties, asking their landlords to basically upgrade them. In which case, some of the landlords said, basically, I'm not going to upgrade them. I don't have the cash to, etc. And they basically said, look, we're either going to basically stop the contracts when it comes to an end, or we're going to have to basically hand back the property from now, because it kind of breaches their agreement. I think some of them had was an F when it wasn't supposed to be an F, to be fair, should have been E. But then they came to us and said, well, will you be interested in buying these properties from the landlords? So that sort of sparked a bit of an opportunity, and we bought 1 or 2 properties in that specific way. So yeah, it develops relationships, but it also opens a lot of doors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the whole thing about supported living is so much of it comes down to relationships. I mean, so much property does anyway, doesn't it? It's a people game really at the heart of it. But I think with supported living, it's even more so, isn't it? I think,
Yeah, absolutely. And you're dealing with organizations that don't necessarily have the capacity to deal with a lot of stuff. So they really want to deal with a small amount of people rather than a large amount of people, because the back end operations is very thin sometimes. That they're stretched a lot of the time. So you need to be thinking about how can you make their life easier. Can you group everything into one email rather than a million emails in a week, kind of thing. These little things, communication, can it be done much easier via WhatsApp, for example? In some situations where you're dealing with the property managers, because they have individual property managers, could you deal with them on WhatsApp? Could you create WhatsApp groups sometimes? Not everyone likes that. Some people hate it, some people like it, but it all depends on, trying to adapt and adjust to what they want and what they need.
And it's a very different way of working, isn't it? I know you've just sort of touched on that a little bit, but for a lot of providers, they're working, like you say, they're very thin on the ground. Property is something else. It's almost an inconvenience, isn't it? It's something else they have to make work to be able to provide the support they want to provide. So they're not necessarily property people. They're approaching it from a very different angle. And for a lot of people, the focus is on the support and the care provision, which is where it should be, So if you can take the pain away for them by providing properties and making it easier, is definitely the right way to go. Saying that, I think with more people interested in supported living, we find a lot of providers are being a little bit swamped by property investors, perhaps offering inappropriate properties, having expectations of yield and lease length that maybe isn't very sustainable. And I think it is difficult, isn't it, for them to manage it when it gets like that.
Yeah, I think the problem is people look at the low hanging fruit and think, well, they compare everything to exempt accommodation rates, and they look at I know a lot of people have been selling stuff to a lot of the funds, etc., and looking at basically maximizing it and really trying to get the most out of it. But that's not really what supported living should be about, in all honesty. But I think that has set the bar for what other investors are looking at and thinking, oh, hold on a second, here's another shiny penny. So they were looking at service accommodation, they were looking at HMOs, they look at all these things, and now suddenly, supported living is the new shiny penny for them. So I think realistically, it's one of these things that people need to be realistic about,
Yeah, it's got to work for everybody, hasn't it? And I think some of those models that you were talking about, where people are setting them up to sell them onto funds, they don't necessarily work brilliantly for the providers on the ground, or necessarily the tenants, because the rents have been squeezed, not squeezed, what actually the profits of the providers get at the end of it have been squeezed so much, there's not enough to maintain properties well or provide a high level of support. So
yeah, agreed.
I think it's a space that's hopefully going to have a lot more change, I think, to shake it up a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that already, aren't we? We're seeing a lot of regulation coming in various ways and shapes and forms. So hopefully that's going to, I guess, prevent people from thinking in that way from the beginning, and hopefully try and change things from the beginning rather than at the end once they've already done, and trying to unwind the leases,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a good 5-year, 3-year lease that's just going to keep renewing. Actually, if you're holding that in your own portfolio, that's absolutely fine. That's a really nice thing to have, isn't it? You don't necessarily need to be going for those really high long leases, really.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. I know something else people talk about a lot with supported living is supported living in HMOs, and I think there's quite a lot of confusion around planning classifications, Article 4 supported living, whether that's exempt from Article 4 restrictions and licensing. And I know it's something that you've had experience of, Saif. I wondered if you'd just share some of your experiences and your thoughts around that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, look, I'm not a planning consultant by any means. I think this is just coming from my experience. But when we review a lot of our pain points, and when we look at our pain points, we then look at doing a lot of research. So I do a lot of research into it, trying to understand really, because as property developers, investors, whichever way you want to look at it, you need to have a fundamental understanding of the legal process, the accountancy process, the health and safety plan. You need to have a real good baseline knowledge of all this stuff, because ultimately you need to be able to position your advisors, if you like, or your power team, whichever way you want to call it, really. You want to position them in the right way, and you need to steer them in the right direction. You can't just depend on them to say, here it is, you do everything. You need to give them a background, you need to try and steer them. So from my perspective, I looked into planning, we looked into the licensing as well. It can be quite confusing, so we'll hopefully try and bust a lot of those myths as well out there, and the perceptions, I guess. So if we look at health and safety, we look at licensing from a first point of view. So usually when you look at the RPs or housing association providers, so these are the guys that are sat right at the top. So these are normally the guys that are getting funding directly from either the council or central government, depending on how they're getting their funding. But these guys are the guys that sit right at the top. Usually they have their own exempt classification. So from their perspective, they almost sit as similar to how the council sit from a health and safety perspective. So they should be policing that HMO from a health and safety perspective in the exact same way as the HMO officer will be policing it if he came to do an inspection. So technically speaking, you don't need a license if you sat with one of them as a direct leasee, I guess, if you like to look at it that way. Some providers, the providers that sit between you and the RP or the housing association directly, they don't have that status, in which case you will need to provide a license for them. But I think just to avoid, for the avoidance of doubt, you always need to ask them, do we need a HMO license? Do you guys sit in a similar status to what the council sit in terms of you are exempt and actually you are pretty much the regulators, I guess, similar to how the council are, or do we actually need to have a license? And they should, 9 times out of 10, be able to answer you on that question. So that's sort of the first thing. Now, for the people that already have a license in place, there's no reason why you shouldn't keep that license in place. You're not going to lose anything. You're not going to get your refund pro rata if you cancel that license. So if you've got a license in place, keep it. If you need to renew it, just double check with the provider whether you do or don't need that first and foremost. And at least you have that in writing there, and it's very clear. So that's from a health and safety, that's from a licensing perspective. When you look at stuff from a planning perspective, so technically supported living, and it really does depend on a few factors, but just really broad brush, technically speaking, supported living for under 6 occupants of a property comes under C3B. So it's still residential use class, but C3B basically is the use class it will come under. As soon as you go over 7, then it goes under sui generis anyway. So SG is the official class. So that's whether it is going to be professionally tenanted students or it's going to be supported living. It all sits under SG for over 6 tenants. So that's 7 tenants plus. So below that, realistically, it shouldn't be a C4 certificate. So it's not house and multiple occupation as such, because a lot of these people sit with either, well, technically from your perspective, you're leasing out the whole property as a whole as one household, even though it's different people from obviously different families, etc. But you're leasing out as one household to a provider, and then they're obviously handling it from there. So from your perspective, it should come under C3B. And that means in Article 4 areas that do have Article 4 implemented and they've taken away C3 to C4, then you can look at getting C3B, and that comes under permitted development. So that's a certificate of lawful use to basically say that this is the use class as of today.
I think, and the element of that is that they're forming a household, aren't they? And because they're sharing care, that creates, and that shared tenancy arrangement creates that one household, and that's the kind of argument for that under 6, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's also from experience and conversations I've had with lots of other people, it seems to be HMO officers interpret it differently in different places around the country, and I think it's always worth having a conversation with your HMO officer and this is what I'm thinking of doing, and running it by them and just getting their take on it as well. Because if you've
the way I look at this stuff is a lot of, we were just discussing today, like lenders are very pedantic about so many things. They want to tick a box. HMO officers are very similar. The council are very similar. So you've got an option really of either A, trying to basically push back on them, which you can do. You can only push back with facts, and you need to basically point them into the right direction of facts. So whether you want to get your planning consultant involved, whether you want to get whoever it is involved to basically show them the facts and point that out. Or the other thing is you can either comply with them, basically say, look, I know they're wrong, I know I'm right, but actually, just for the sake of just being easy with it, I don't want them to go against me as such for future applications and think that you don't want them to be difficult. Let me just comply with them. So 2 separate things here. Being on the right side of the law is one thing, but then also trying to go head on with a planning officer or go head on with a building regs officer is a totally different thing. You need to then take a step back and think, as a business, do I need to do this, or do I need to just say, you know what, I'm right, they're wrong, we'll agree to disagree, but we'll do it their way to keep them pleased. And I think this is just something that you need to do in everyday life, you know, in general.
Absolutely. But I think even if you're letting your property to an RP and it is an HMO, but you don't need to do the licensing, it still needs to meet all of the health and safety stuff, doesn't it? It still needs to be minimum room sizes, fire safety standards, all of that stuff should be in place, as any good landlord should be doing that and ensuring that, you know, I think it's not a way
absolutely
to slip small room sizes under the radar and still claim HMO rates or whatever for it. I think it's
absolutely. And I think that the whole point is they are still policing it, and that's the key, that's the key message, is that it's still being policed. It's just the fact that you don't have to go through that application sometimes for an RP, and as long as they're happy with that as well, and obviously you've got that in writing, then from your perspective you don't have to go through that. But you know, even we do that as good practice, because you can see regulation coming in all over. So I think the HMO licenses are going to be needed from probably 4 people and more at some point as well. So we trying to do everything that we can to try and think ahead. So even on the 4 beds, we're trying to keep up to the regs, and you know, we're almost acting as if we're doing a 4 bed, well, you've got to think, if there's a license in place, what do you need, and try and do it that way, because you're almost future proofing a lot of your assets anyway, you know.
Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Absolutely, to just be thinking ahead a bit like that. Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. I had a conversation with one of the specialist RPs recently about HMOs, and they said they can't actually pay HMO rates for a house. They have to pay a house rental rate for a house, because the regulator will see that they're overpaying for a property. So say it's a 4-bed house that you think could be a 5 or 6-bed HMO, they can only pay market rent for a 4-bed family house in that area on that property, because the regulator's investigating and cracking down on those. So it's another interesting take on it. Although you might be able to step outside having to have the license, actually you may not be able to get the high rents and yields that you would expect with it being.
And I think, you know, that there's no magic bullet, and there's no way to say supported living is better than private rents or student or anything like that. I always say it's good to have a healthy mixed portfolio, so diversification is key. And also I think you've got to look at, you know, there's a lot more frictional costs involved in it, but then at the same time you're getting the guaranteed rent, so you've really got to figure out what's more important to you. And actually it should, you know, I would never want to have 100% of my portfolio supported living for sure, but at the same time I never want 10% of it. I probably want 20, maybe 30% supported living. That's a good healthy balance, because you've got to think about insurance, you've got to think about mortgages, you know, there's a lot more frictional costs involved than a normal. But at the same time, I really like the fact that it's guaranteed rent. I don't have to think about that, you know. So that I don't know what you want to call it, really. I guess that's that feeling in your stomach when someone says, "Oh, your property's now vacant," and it's sat there, and you don't really want. That's probably one of the things I hate. I mean, I've got used to it now after having a couple of properties in the portfolio. You get used to it, but generally speaking, you don't have that with this. So yes, you get maintenance issues probably with some of them, depending on how you've got your lease terms, but you don't get that feeling. So if that's a big thing for people, then supported living is certainly something that they need to be looking into.
It's really important. But I think what you're referring to is the frictional costs there are really important to acknowledge, aren't they? And I think people are kind of doing the numbers on very inflated rents and not looking at the additional costs that can be incurred in it. And I think, do you want to talk a little bit more about those? You alluded to insurance being higher with supported living, and that's certainly very true, isn't it? What other things do you think people need to consider there?
Yeah, so the way we look at stuff is on a net basis. So there's no point in looking at gross, because gross doesn't give you the exact picture of what's happening. And we look at stuff on a net basis. And actually, part of that is obviously you've got insurance, but you've also got things like lending as well. Now, I know some people are doing lending under the radar. So they're doing the actual, you know, they're doing the loan on the property. And it could be that they did it genuinely. So they've got a professional tenant in there. Professional tenant's now left. The supported living provider's moved in. They could have either forgotten to obviously let the lender know, or they just don't want the headache of doing it, in which case it's probably wrong, rightly or wrongly. But from that perspective,
exactly, they're in breach of mortgage terms, aren't they? Yeah, exactly.
And I think if you're going to do it correctly, I mean, some of my mortgages for supported living providers are anything sort of have stuff from 4.39% to 4.99% as well. So that's kind of the range. Whereas on standard private stuff, I think it really sits in the threes. I know people look at 2% as the holy grail, but it's so difficult to get that. It's really in the threes. That's where we're at normally. So, you know, it's about 1 percentage point higher on an annual basis, which is not the end of the world, but you've got to factor that in. But then factor that in. So what I always say to people is look at your voids, look at your maintenance bills, look at your wear and tear, look at your bills. Because, you know, during COVID, bills have gone up massively. People are in their houses now. And, you know, for HMOs, we've seen it increase quite a lot. So on supported living, you don't have that because they don't pay the bill. So when you look at factor in all those costs and then factor in the cost of supported living, it all depends. You've got to do your own homework on it. But it sometimes works out more cost effective. Sometimes it works out less cost effective. It depends on the property. But yeah, we always do that as an exercise, really. So you've got insurance and mortgage is most likely going to be higher than standard private rentals.
And time as well. Sometimes they take longer to set up, don't they? I think that needs to be acknowledged as well, that it's not always as straightforward to get the scheme set up. But the longer term implications, of having that rent every month for 3-5 years, however long your leases can outweigh.
Yeah, it's setting and forget. I mean, I don't know about you, Lisa, but it's probably a question that I'd be interested in your answer on. But from our perspective, touch wood, so far we've never ever had to give back a property that we basically come to an end of a lease. We've always renewed. The only time that we've, again, it would come back to the whole EPC. One of the providers said, "Could you upgrade the EPC?" And we said, "We happily will." Why would we not do that? No. And I think we put loft insulation and maybe changed a couple of the windows. That's about it. But we've never ever had it where a provider's come back to us and said, "Can we basically hand back the keys?" So I don't know about you and what your thoughts are on that as well.
I think, no, absolutely. I think it's generally their long-term commitments, aren't they? I mean, it all depends on your tenants. If you've got transitional tenants, it's a service which is a move-on service, but for a lot of the properties, they're long-term homes for people, aren't they? And the ones that I've done have been that long-term. This is someone's going to be someone's home. It's adapted to meet their needs, and that's their home. And certainly the providers that I'm speaking to all the time are telling me that I only really want to take out a 3 or a 5 year lease at the moment because I'm just trying to work out my business plan, but I know this will be a long-term home for somebody. So yeah, I think the intention generally with most providers is that is a long-term commitment, isn't it? It's not going anywhere. Yeah,
I think the other interesting point is what happens when the provider's contract comes to an end as well, because it's a question that I get asked a lot. It's like, they've got a contract for 5 years. What happens at the end of that 5 years if they don't win that tender as well? And I'll be interested to hear your answer on this. But I guess from my point of view, a lot of it comes down to either if it is another provider that takes it over, they'll probably take over that lease as well. But sometimes they're sort of non-commissioned and commissioned services, so they can kind of move things about if they need to into non-commissioned, depending on what it is. Really, if it's children, then it's quite difficult because it's going to be commission service. If it's like you said, really, if it's just general homelessness and just getting people off the streets, then that generally comes under non-commission. But correct me if I'm wrong, you probably know more about this than I do anyway.
You're entirely right. And I think it depends on the structure you have with your arrangement. If you have an RP, a registered provider, the housing association taking that lease on your property, then actually that's with your tenancy agreement was with them, not with the care provider. And the care and support provider arrangements often in supported living are often around 5 years. But actually, if that individual has that tenancy arrangement with your house, then you have that proper separation of care and tenancy that should be in the long-term support needs with the sort of learning disabilities, mental health, autism, then actually your relationship with the RP will continue. Your tenant will stay in the property, but the care provider might be swapped in and out at the end of their contract if they're not renewed. So from your perspective, that maintains. You're right, those unregulated areas of care where you're looking at the lower level support needs, transitional care, while people are supported to move on to their own tenancies, they might be the ones that maybe will be potentially less secure because your arrangement is with that provider. So if they lose that contract, then potentially that could be at the end of the contract not renewed, and you might find that your tenancy is handed back to you then.
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but it just varies, doesn't it, from different things. And there's not to say that if that contract finished, that another provider wouldn't want to step in and take it. The local authority might say, actually, we've got a property set up here already. Do you want to take it over?
Agreed. Yeah, no, 100%.
But that depends on commissioner relationships and a million other things, doesn't it? And not necessarily commissioned, like you said. Some of it isn't commissioned. So
it's a whole nother conversation. That I think
it is, and I think that's the thing. I think that it is so complex, and there's so many different things to get lined up, and so many different things to understand with it, that it can get a bit confusing. But essentially, it works very well once it's set up, doesn't it?
Definitely.
Saif, thank you. It's been really great talking to you. I know I don't know if you want to share any tips or any advice for some of the property investors who are looking at getting into supported living, or kind of
just I guess general broad brush tips really, but just generally I think we come back to this point of try and make sure you've got multiple exits on your property before you go into a supported living provider, because you don't want to be looked at as desperate, one of these desperate landlords, or trying to be too pushy as well, because I think I've heard it before, whether it's Clubhouse or anything, and all these platforms, they're trying to be too pushy with the providers, and reality is, yeah, sometimes I get it. Your properties are empty. You need to try and push for it, but just do not be desperate, because they will smell that from a mile away, and they'll understand that as well. So really try and be professional, try and be a proper business person, and just say, look, no strings attached. Could you give me an answer within this set period of time? Make it realistic, whether it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, etc., if possible. And that way you won't be let down. And if they say no, go out to the professional market, try and obviously let it there. If it hasn't let out and they've come back and said, we're ready now, no hard feelings, go back to them. So I think it's just understanding that you should not be desperate. You should have multiple exits. And that way, hopefully you'll start to have more clear expectations from the outset.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Thank you for sharing that. We'll put your contact details in the show notes, so if anyone wants to contact you. But thank you, Saif. That's been great. Thank you.
Brilliant. No worries at all. Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, Lisa.